Shalom Aleichem. Today's daf is daf Ayin Gimel, and we got up to Ibois Ema, which is about 5 lines down from the top. If you want, you could say the following: that according to Rabbi Yehuda Hani Mili, these Kohanim and Leviim, Trei Kaholi Ninu, they are two separate Kahalim, and therefore we need two Lishonos of Kol in order to generate an Iser of Psulei Kol. And if that be the case, then we have one extra Kol for Kahal Gerim, and the heter of Mamzer b'Shtuki and Shtuki b'Yisrael Michad Kahol Nafka. So we can now combine Shtuki with a Mamzer in both directions, whether it's the Mamzer who's marrying a Shtuki or the Shtuki marrying a Yisrael, and that's going to be derived from one Kol. As it says, Lo Yavo Mamzer B'Kal Hashem. And the word Mamzer is going to teach us Mamzer Vadai Hu de Lo Yavo Ha Mamzer Sofek Yavo. So a Shtuki is a Sofek Mamzer. We don't know who his father is. He's Mutter B'Kal because the Torah added the word Mamzer as a miyut to establish that only a Mamzer Vadai is prohibited from Kol, but not a Mamzer Sofek. And B'Kahal Vadai Hu de Lo Yavo Ha B'Kal Sofek Yavo. So that means that a Mamzer is excluded from Kahal Vadai, but not from a Kahal Sofek. And therefore Mamzer is Mutter B'Kal Sofek, and therefore we're left with an extra Kol, and from that we're going to derive that a Ger is considered a Kol, and therefore he's not allowed to marry a Mamzer. Iboy Sema, the Gemara has a third explanation for Rabbi Yehuda. Hani Nami Trei Kaholinu. Even these are considered two Kaholim, meaning the two drashas to be matir a Sofek Mamzer in Kal Hashem, and to be matir a Mamzer Vadei in a Sofek Kol. We need both psukim, and you cannot derive one from the other. And therefore, we don't have an extra Kol to teach me that Kahal Gerim is considered a Kal, and therefore they're Asurim B'Mamzer. So where's Rabbi Yehuda going to derive that conclusion from? And the Gemara answers, time of the Rabbi Yehuda Mihacha. There's an extra pasuk in the Parsha of Nesachim in Bamidbar Tesvav. It says HaKahol Chuka Achas Lachem V'Lager Agar. And here the word HaKahol at the beginning of the pasuk is to be linked with Ger at the end of the pasuk, even though wedged in between is the word Chuka and the phrase Chuka Achas Lachem. Now we're going to take the Ger at the end and the Kol at the beginning and make it into Kal Gerim. And once we define and classify Kal Gerim as a Kol, therefore they're Asurim B'Mamzer. Ul Rabbi Yossi. What does Rabbi Yossi do with this pasuk? Chuka Achas Hifsika Inyan. He understood that the words Chuka Achas wedged between HaKol at the beginning of the pasuk and Ger at the end of the pasuk teach me that Ger is not considered Kol. And therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, a Ger is allowed to marry a Mamzer. We'll see a story with Rava in just a minute. Now, on Daf Ayin Beis, on Beis, we quoted a brisa which ended with the words Echad Ger v'Echad Eved b'Shuchra v'Cholol Mutarim b'Kohanis. A Bas Kohen is allowed to get married to a Cholol, or to a Ger, or to an Eved Meshuchra. And these are Psulei Kahuna. Misayel Leila Rav, Diomar Rav Yudam Rav Lo Huzaru Kohanos Ksheros Li Nose Lipsulim. That when the Torah prohibited marriage, it was only for the male Kohen, but not for the female Kohanes, and she's allowed to marry Psulim. Okay, now we're going to get a story about Rabbi Zera who gave a drasha in Mechoza, and about Rava who gave a drasha in Mechoza. Now, Mechoza was a city that was that the residents of the city of Mechoza were Gerim. Now, here you have machlokes exactly what this means. Were they all Gerim or mostly Gerim? And Rabbi Zera made almost a critical error. Why? Darash, he got in front of the public arena in Mechoza, and he darshened ger mutar b'mamzeres, which means that ger is not considered kol, like Rabbi Yosef. That was not a smart thing to do publicly in a place that's made up of gerim. And ragmu kule alba besrogayim. They started pelting him with esrogim, because basically, according to Rabbi Zera, a ger is not considered kol. They weren't very appreciative of that ruling. So a whole long discussion here about esrogim. Well, what's the connection here with esrogim? What was it? It was Sukkot when he made this drasha? Ma inyan esrogim l'drashas Rabbi Zera sheger mutar b'mamzeres. And therefore, the Gemara in Sukkah is very helpful on Chaf Hayamid Beis that says that Rabbi Zera got married on Erev Chag HaSukkos, as I state in the Gemara. So the first day of Yom Tov Sukkos was the first of his 7 days of Mishnah. And the Chassan used to give a drasha. Not like today, the Chassan starts and they right away sing, Simon Tov and Mazel Tov, and cut him off. And he gave this drasha in Mechoza on the very first day of his Shivas Yimei Mishnah after he got married the night before, and they pelted him with esrogim. Amar Rava said, Mi ika didorish milsa ki hai. This was a silly thing for him to do. Would a person darshan that kind of a drasha beduchta the shchichai giore in a place where there's so many residents who are gerim? That's not the proper place. That's not a smart thing to do. So what did Rava do? He also gave a drasha mechosa, but he did it in a very smart way. He opened his drasha by establishing that ger mutar b'kohenes. In other words, Rava is saying that gerim are considered ksherim, and therefore kohenes is allowed to marry a ger. But in truth, Rava didn't really say anything of substance, because a kohenes is allowed to marry even a cholol, even psulim. But he did it as a trick. Tanu b'shirayim. They showered him with meshi, with like beautiful cloths of meshi. It's almost like they carried him piggyback. But Hadar Darshlu, and then afterwards, he dashed in the additional statement that Rabbi Zera had mentioned earlier, ger mutar b'mamzeres, because the kahal of gerim is not considered a kol. Amrulei, so the Bnei Mechoza said, well, you added that statement, afsidinu l'kamaisa. You lost your original statement. In other words, originally we gave you shevach vodah. We were so excited. Now we're going to change that all to gnai. Amar lehu, but Rava said to them, ditava lechu avdi lechu. I did you a great service by giving you these 2 halachas. Ibai mi hachanosiv, ibai mi hachanosiv. If you want to marry a kohenes, you can marry a kohenes. If you want to marry psulei kol, you can marry psulei kol. I'm just expanding your opportunities for marriage. Ve'hilchasa, the Gemara passes like Rav Yossi, ger mutar b'kohenes, u'mutar b'mamzeres, mutar b'kohenes, shelo huzru ksheros linasi l'psulim. This is only a specific application of a general rule. A kohenes is allowed to marry psulim; she can marry a ger. And mutar b'mamzeres kid Rabbi Yossi, like the Shita Rabbi Yossi, the kal gerim is not considered kol. We learned to the Mishnah Elu Heim Shtuki. Who is a Shtuki? Who is not allowed to come into Kal Yisrael Ksherim? Kol Shem Makir. Makir means Makir is Imo. Vieno Makir is Aviv. We don't know who his father was. Omar Rava. Rava says, why do we exclude a Shtuki from Kal Yisrael? Is it an Isur Torah or an Isur Rabbanan Rav Dvar Torah Shtuki kosher? We can be matir Shtuki, even though we don't know who the identity of his father is. My time of Rov Ksherim Etzla. What does this mean? Remember, we had more than once a machlokes about Eved v'Akum Shebal Bas Yisrael as to whether or not the child is a mamzer. And we're holding now, in this particular sugi of Rava, that Eved v'Yakum Abol Basrol ein avlad mamzer. And therefore, Rov Cherem Etzla, even if you assume that the Boel, who had a relationship with this Bas Yisrael, and they had a child from that Be'ilah, even if I assume the Boel was a guy, the child is not a mamzer. And therefore he's allowed to come into Kal. And that's based on Rov. And therefore, Mid Psulim Etzla, in other words, what are the chances are that the Boel, the father of this child, the unknown father, unidentified father, is a mamzer, or a relative of hers that would create mamzeres through Gili Arayas? That's only a mute. How many mamzer are out there? How many krovim are out there in the world that would make the child into a mamzer? And therefore, based on this rov, the Torah would allow a shtuki whose father is unidentified to marry a Bas Yisrael. However, this depends on the famous sugya, which we've had in Psachim, we had it in Ksubis, and many other sugyas in Shas, called Kol the Parsh Meruva Parsh or Kol Kavur Kemechzal Mechzadam. I Azla Inu Gaba, if the Boel came to her and had Be'ilah for her, then called the Parsh Meruva Parsh, we assume that the Boel came out of the Rov. And therefore the Shtuki was born from a Be'ilah of the Boel of the Rov, which means that he's not a Mamzer. So the Gemara says, my Amrit, you might argue against me, Dilma Azla I maybe she went to him, and in his house they had the Be'ilah from which this child was born. Then Havile Kavua, because when we look at the man, he's stationary in his place, and Kol Kavua Kametzal Mechzadam. And then you're going to tell me Torah Amr Yavu Mamzer B'Kal Hashem. So the child is a suffix Mamzer, says the Gemara. Mamzer Vadehu Delo Yavo, Mamzer Suffix Yavo. Remember the drush that we had earlier on this daf, that is that the Torah only prohibits a Mamzer Vadei. This is a Mamzer Suffix because Kol Kavua Kametzal Mechzadam. And furthermore, B'Kal Vadei Hu Delo Yavo, or B'Kal Suffix Yavo. We established that a shtuki who is Kal Suffix, he's allowed to come into Klal Yisrael. Only a Kal Vadei is excluded. So Matam Omru Shtuki Posel. In other words, by definition, Rav is saying there can't be that Shtuki is Posel in a Torah, it's got to be in Rabbanon. Why did the Rabbanon institute a Psul de Rabbanon? And the Gemara answers, Shema Isa Achoso Aviv. Since the Shtuki cannot identify his father, it's possible that he will have a relationship with his paternal sister. He would never have a relationship with his maternal sister because he knows who his mother is, and therefore he knows that this is his sister. But if he doesn't know who his father was, then as luck would have it, he went ahead and he married his own sister, not knowing that she was his paternal sister, because he doesn't know his father's. So the Gemara asks, Elamei Ata, Shtukis, Lo Yisa, Shema Yisa, Achoso Me'aviv. We said that Shtukim are allowed to marry each other. Why is that so? He might be marrying his own sister. And the Gemara answer is, no, we're not choshish for that. Kol ki hani mizanu v'azle. Should we assume that all the fathers of the Shtukim are mizanin v'holchim? In other words, are we going to be told that all the Shtuki here were niv'olos to the same person, such that maybe the child from such a relationship is going to marry his own sister? Now the Gemara asks another kasha. Even after you've explained to me that we're not going to be choshesh shema yisach chosame aviv, because it's not logical to assume that all the shtukia here came from the same father. I still have a kasha, bash shtukis lo yisa. We should not allow the daughter of a shtukis to marry a shtuki. Sheba yisa chosom me'ovid. Here we have to be choshesh. Maybe her father is the boel of the shtukis. But rather, the reason why the Chazal did not generate an Iser of a Bashtukis, afraid, based on the Chashash, maybe he'll marry his own sister, it's because the Shtuki lo shchicha. It's Eno Motzu. And we have a principle called Milsa lo shchicha lo gozu be'rabbanan. If that be the case, Achinami lo shchicha, so too, in a Shtuki, we're going to say that that's not a Dover Motzui, and the Chacham are not going to create an Isra or a Shtuki to marry Yisraelis because maybe he's marrying his sister. So now we're still stuck. Why don't we allow a Shtuki to marry a Jewish girl? Because the Chash that this girl might be, that he might be marrying his sister is Lo Shchicha. And we said that Midaraisa, there's no Isa. Mara says that the whole psul of Shtuki D'Rabbanan is only to be metaken yuchsin. In other words, we have to be very, very careful, extra careful about yuchsin. Now we're talking about a child that was nesaf min hashuk. He was found abandoned in the marketplace, in a public area. And we don't know who is his father. We don't know who is his mother. He's not allowed to come l'kol. Omar Ravid var Torah Sufi Kosher. Wow, even in a case where I cannot identify neither of his parents, nevertheless, he's allowed to come into the kol on a Doraisa level. My time. What's the reason for this? Maybe he's a mamzer, this Asufi. Meaning that his mother had a relationship out of marriage, which generates mamzeris. She didn't want to let the word out that she had such a relationship, so she took the child and abandoned the child. So the Gemara answers, Eishes Ishba Baila Tola. She doesn't have to be afraid and abandon the child in a public place because she can fool the world into thinking that she was impregnated by her own husband without DNA testing. My Ika, so what would be the Chashash of Mamzeris here? Miut Arusos Umiut Nisuos, we'll add that word. Shaholach ba'aleim lemedinas hayam. We're going to talk about arusos. If an arusa had an extramarital relationship, she can't be tola on her husband. She can't tell the world of fake news that she's pregnant through her husband because she never consummated the marriage with her husband. But that's a mute. We have another miut of married women whose husbands went to Medina Sayyam, and no one has seen their husband for a long, extended period of time, and therefore she cannot fake out the world and say, well, it was my husband who impregnated me. Excuse me. However, we're not going to make a general rule and prohibit an Asufi from marrying into Klal Yisrael based on these two mi'utim, but rather we're going to go by the road. Kema de'ika pnuya ve'ika nami demach masra avod havi palgu palgu. Maybe the child was born from a pnuya, and therefore the child is kosher. Not only that, it's possible that this Asufi was born to a woman from her husband Bekashrus. Why did she place the child out there in the shuk? Because she was so poverty-stricken that she didn't have food in the cupboards to feed the child. And therefore, she was hoping that somebody would find the child and feed the child. So if we add this all together, what we're ending up with is palgal palga. It's a suffix shakel. We don't know if he's kosher or he's possible. If he was born from a pnuya or from a situation of re'avon, of hunger, then the vlad is kosher. On the other hand, if the child was born from an arusa or from an isha shaholach bailu b'diyas hayam, the vlad is possible. Torah Amar lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem mamzer vadei hu de lo yavo ha mamzer sofik yavo and b'kal vadei hu de lo yavo ha b'kal sofik yavo, and therefore b'dat Torah, even if we cannot identify either of the parents, the child is allowed to come l'kol. Umatam Amar, why did the Rabbanan prohibit it? Asufi pasuk gzeira shema yisa achoso me'av. I'm a little bit confused here because we were speaking before about the possibility that the father was a god. So why don't we consider the possibility that even the mother was a god? I'm missing something. You have any notes on this? It's an obvious question.
Yeah, the article footnote seems to say it's a town where most people are Jewish.
Ah, okay. I was missing that. Right, so since the town is mostly Jewish, therefore we're not going to be worried about the possibility that this child is a guy. The child, by definition, is assumed to be Jewish. Then the question is if the child is a mamzer, and on that the Gemara says it's palgal palga. Even in a case where you have arusos, or holach bailu b'dinas hayam, where there's more of a reason to assume the child is a mamzer, but mamzer vadei osir rachman v'lo mamzer sofik. But the Rabbanan pasal it shema yisa achoso me'av. Back to Gemara el mi'ata, again the same shaklutai that we had before. If the Rabbanan are pasaling because of the chashash of shema yisa achoso me'aviv, then asufis lo yisa. Then you cannot allow two people who have the same psul, he's an asufi, she's an asufis, to marry each other. Sheba yisa chosom me'aviv o me'imo. Now at this point I thought the Gemara was again going to activate the principle of Ma'ila Asu b'Yuchsin. But that's not really so, because Ma'ila Asu b'Yuchsin only applies when one of the two is a kosher. Here they're both asufi. So we would make a Ma'ila b'Yuchsin because of an asufi to allow them to marry each other. But rather the Gemara answers that we don't have an Isur here Michshash Yisha b'Yisa Choso because Kol Hani Shadi v'Azli. So what does this answer the Gemara? Kol Hani Shadi v'Azli. And you have to read it with a question mark. Oh yeah. In order to assume the possibility that the Asufi who's marrying an Asufis is marrying his own sister, you would have to assume that this woman took all her children and she was mashlich them. And therefore, all the Asufim came from the same mother, or for that matter, from the same father. That's already too far out. But the Gemara asks another kasha. Even if you'll tell me in the case of Asufi and Asufis, there's no chash of Bas Aviv or Bas Imo, meaning that he'll have a marriage relationship with his own sister, it's still difficult. Bas Asufi lo Yisa, Shema Yisa Chosa. Right? How can we allow a man to marry an Asufis, meaning the Bas of an Asufi? We don't know who the father is, and therefore it might be his own sister. Ella, we have no choice but to assume that there's no chash in the case of a Sufi, that'll marry his own sister, lo shchiach. And if it's lo shchiach, lo gozu be'rabbanan. It's hachinami lo shchiach. Here too, in the case of a Sufi, we're not going to say that the Chacham should prohibit him from marrying a Bas Yisrael because maybe he's marrying his achos or me'aviv. That's a no matzli lo gozu be'rabbanan. And now the Gemara finally swings back to give the same old answer that it gave before, namely, Ela Maila Osu B'Yuchsin. Chacham made a Maila B'Yuchsin, a tikkun of Dinei B'Yuchsin, and they prohibited the Asufi from marrying marrying a Bas Yisrael. Omar Rava Barafuna Mitzo Mohul Ein Bo Mishum Asufi.